Thank you so much for joining us today on the Real Estate Mentor Podcast. I am your host, Jonathan Klunk, based out of Louisville, Kentucky, and I am very honored today to have our special guest, Tony Robinson. Tony is on the Bigger Pockets Rookie Podcast, where he is a host. He is an authority on real estate investing, especially in the short-term rental market. So you know that we're going to have a lot to talk about today because that is a passion of mine. He also has a very inspiring backstory. He really got into real estate investing when he was laid off from a very high-pressure job. And just a couple of years, though, after that, he amassed a huge real estate portfolio in the multi-millions of dollars, a lot of that in short-term rentals. So without further ado, let's welcome Tony and dig into our conversation primarily about short-term rentals today. Tony, thanks for being on the podcast with us.
Yeah, excited to be here, man. Short-term rentals is my jam, so I love that we got a little bit of a common backstory there, man. Excited to jump into it.
Yeah, and at the end of the podcast, we're going to dig into your new company, Airvato, that you've just launched, and that is a luxury short-term rental management company. So definitely a lot of conversation we can have around there since that's my background of 9 years. I want to kick it off by talking about something that I think that you're really skilled at, and that is finding short-term rental markets that have a lot of revenue growth potential. Talk to us about the landscape and how you evaluate it and find new opportunities in maybe cities that you've never been to or don't have a lot of information on.
Yeah, it really is an important question, Jonathan, especially for a lot of folks who are looking to get started for the first time in the short-term rental industry. I think a common misconception that a lot of folks makes when they think about buying a short-term rental is that they go with cities that they already know. And then they almost try and force that city to match with their situation. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think what's more important and maybe a smarter approach is that you have to identify what your motivations are first, and then let those motivations dictate maybe what city makes the most sense for you. Because, we're talking about revenue growth, which is cash flow, basically. And that is a metric that's important for a lot of real estate investors. However, there are some folks who get into the short-term rental industry for no reason other than they want to take advantage of all the tax benefits. There are some people who are focused on maybe long-term appreciation and then having an asset in the market that they want to vacation to. So maybe they're not as concerned about cash flow today. They just want to break even and then, have a paid for vacation home 30 years down the road. So before we even go, I'll go into what I think is important for the revenue piece, but I just want to add that caveat first that you've got to identify what your motivations are first and then let that lead you down to the right analysis.
I'm glad that you said that because I work with buyers. I'm more on the buyer side now since we've left the management behind us. And a lot of people reach out and they have a hefty budget that they can buy anywhere. And they want to rely on me to tell them where they should buy. I mean, literally, the world is their oyster. Any state, all 50 states, whatever has the most appreciation, revenue generation. And, that is a daunting task for somebody that I might know very little about. And that is one thing that I always kind of task them with first is let's find a place that at least you might be able to use. Where are the top 5 or 10 places where you might like to vacation and kind of start narrowing it down from there so you can get use of the property.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What we tell folks is you as an individual have to rank from most important to least important: appreciation, taxes, cash flow, and the vacation piece. Because someone whose top 2 are appreciation and vacation are very different than the person who says my number 1 is cash flow and then tax benefits, right? Like those are 2 very different demographics. So we force people to make that decision to say what's most important for me. Now, in terms of actually identifying these cities, Jonathan, I think there's a lot of different ways you can go about this. But for us specifically, if cash flow is the goal, the first thing we want to look at is the overall health of the market. And there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of gauge saturation, competitiveness, however you want to phrase it. But the easiest way I found is to look at the year over year change in RevPAR, or revenue per available room, for folks who aren't familiar with that phrase. And guys, basically it's a combination of your average daily rate and your occupancy. It's a measurement of revenue. But sites like AirDNA, they track RevPAR on a market by market basis. So what I'd like to do is go into a market and understand how has RevPAR been changing on a year-over-year basis. And we all know that 2021 was a bit of a flashpoint for short-term rentals, and a lot of 2022 as well. So if you see 2021 as this, anomaly that's incredibly high, I wouldn't be too concerned about that because that was pretty widespread across a lot of different markets. But if you look at 2022 and 2023 and the first few months of 2024, and you see a consistent negative trend where 2024 is lower than 2023, which was lower than 2022, I would be concerned about saturation or the level of saturation in that market. And it would lead me to believe we don't know if we're at the bottom yet. What if 2025 is lower than 2024?
Right.
And if you're underwriting on 2024's numbers, well, you just missed the mark by 5, 10, 20%, whatever that decrease is. Now, if I see markets that are going in the opposite direction, where I look at 2022 and there's growth from 2022 to 2023, and there's growth from 2023 to 2024, okay, well, now I've got some data to show that, hey, there's some room for some additional properties in this market. And, I could talk on this topic for hours, Jonathan, but the only caveat the only caveat that I'd add to that is even within the market, there are certain subsets of data you can look at because sometimes the saturation isn't necessarily market-wide, but it's at a bedroom level count. So you might look at one market and at the 1, the 2, and the 3, and the 4 bedrooms, it's saturated and you see that decrease year over year of RevPAR. But when you look at the 5 bedrooms and bigger, there's growth there because there's less inventory. So you can get as into the weeds as you want, but at a high level, Jonathan, that's how we typically look at things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to take a look at it. So tell me, whenever you're watching these trends that happen, if there are big jumps year over year, does that also scare you? Because if you go in to a market that's getting hot, then maybe that can reverse pretty quickly.
That's a great question, right? Because there is the idea, is there a bubble forming maybe in this market as well, right? Here's the things that we've identified and kind of the changes that we're making in our business to maybe insulate ourselves around that, right? First, what we're focusing on now are I still think there's opportunities to be had depending on what your motivation is in some of the major short-term rental destinations, but we're seeing a little bit more opportunity right now in some of the secondary markets, right? So the hotel that we bought, it's in southern Utah, and it's a city that a lot of folks haven't heard of before, but it's very centrally located between a lot of, there's a national park to the east that's 30 miles. There's the Grand Canyon to the south that's, 40 miles. There's another one to the west. So we're finding a lot of opportunities in those markets. And what we're trying to identify is, A, what does the level of competition look like? And if we look at a lot of those other listings in that market and we see that they have poor design, they're lacking a lot of the amenities that guests today are expecting from properties. They have, amateur photos that look like they were taken on, an old flip phone from the 2000s. They've got a basic pricing strategy. Yeah, flip phone, right? God, dude, I'm telling you, I've seen them out there. They've got the pricing strategy where it's one flat price for the entire year. And yet, despite all of those things, they're still getting positive reviews from guests. That lets me know that the level of expectation of guests in that market are significantly lower. And if I can come in with a superior product where I have good design, I have amenities that folks are looking for, I've got the pricing strategy, I have professional photos, why wouldn't someone book my property over this one? So when we're going into these markets, we're looking at those cues, right? Design, amenities, photos, pricing, and reviews to let us know if there's an opportunity to come in and compete. And then the second thing that we want to do, Jonathan, is identify what are some ways that we can create maybe a moat around our property so we're insulated from, even if there is an increase in supply, that it's just hard to compete. I'll give you an example. The very first short-term rental that we ever purchased, it's in the Smoky Mountains, which is a very competitive market. And honestly, I'll say it's not our best property from a design standpoint. We're actually in the process of redesigning it right now. But that property absolutely crushes it because in that city, the majority of the activity happens along this one street. It's called the Parkway. And we are 5 minutes off of that Parkway. So we're super close to everything. So from a location perspective, it's so hard to beat because you get a big 5-bedroom cabin. We're just far away enough to where you feel like you're in the Smoky Mountains, right? You look around and you don't see all the craziness, but you go 2 minutes down the road and you're right there where everything is. So it's insulated because you can't beat that location. Right. Another thing that we're adding to our,
but not too far from the tourists.
But you're not exactly right. You get the best of both. Well, one last example, Jonathan, is we just recently added an in-ground swimming pool to one of our properties. And this is in a market where, hot tubs are everywhere, the cowboy pools are everywhere, but there's a higher barrier of entry for an in-ground swimming pool. So we added that to one of our listings, and now we've got a moat around that because it's harder for people to compete with that. So those are the two things that we're looking at design, amenities, photos, pricing, and reviews. Can we compete? Can we go in there and crush? And then what are some things we can add to our listings that give us a bit of a moat that make it hard for people to compete with us?
Yeah, that's good advice. I always tell people, even if you are in a saturated market or find yourself in a position like that, like you said, Smoky Mountain's very competitive. I've heard some mixed reviews about that lately from, maybe people who got in the middle of the pandemic, overpaid for their properties because it was a little competitive. And now it might be softening a little bit in some of those areas. But at the same time, if you add those amenities, if you have a top market property that's designed well, that shows well, then typically you're going to be head and shoulders still above everybody else. Might not be exactly where you want to be, might have to ride that out a little bit, let the market kind of reach that equilibrium again, let some people sell, exit the market, and then it'll come back and pay you twofold after that.
Yeah, I think one thing that especially a lot of folks who came in during the pandemic wave, we've gotten sort of accustomed, because if you launch your first property like at the tail end of 2020, it doesn't matter what kind of property you have, you absolutely crushed it. And I think a lot of folks got complacent, right? They became complacent because that was their first taste of being an Airbnb investor. So they just assume this is how it's always going to be. But I think what we're recognizing now is that to be successful, you have to run this like a business. And it means that you have to reinvest back into your product to make sure that you stay competitive. It's the same reason that cars release new models every couple of years, because they know they've got to. Right. Imagine if like Ford never released a new F-150 and they were selling the exact same model from the 1990s. Like, would they still be the best selling truck in America? Probably not. But for some reason, for us as Airbnb investors, we think that we can buy a property once, leave it up there for all eternity, and then people are going to want to keep coming back to it. I'll share one quick story on this, man. My wife and I, there's a resort that we like to go down to in Cancun. And we go a couple times a year just to kind of rest and reset. But every time we go there, as we're walking around the grounds of the property, we see them fixing and improving something. It could be small things, like they're just like repainting the stairway rails, or they're replanting flowers, or they're doing something. Or it could be big things. Like one time we went and there was like a whole new wing of this resort that they had built in the months since we had been gone. So I always keep that in the back of my mind, that as an Airbnb investor, you have to reinvest back into your property to maintain that competitiveness.
Absolutely. I've always said short-term rentals are not a set it and forget it business. Whether you're talking about the property itself, the calendar, you referenced earlier, just having the same price across the board, not taking advantage of surge pricing, demand increases in the area, seasonality. All of those are extremely important to the bottom line. But yeah, definitely not a set it and forget it business. That's for sure. Have you ever made a bad short-term rental investment?
Yeah, dude, I wish I could say we had a perfect picker, but we don't. We bought a property, and I don't think the investment itself was necessarily bad, but we bought the property. We launched it, and it was a big rehab deal. And the first guest that checked in, and this is totally on us. We had a hot tub listed as an amenity because we had just like duplicated one of our other listings because they were somewhat similar, but the hot tub hadn't arrived at the property yet, and we missed that it was still checked. So the guest gets there expecting a hot tub. There's no hot tub. Understandably, they're pissed, right? There was glass in the backyard. Like our rehab crew looks like they had maybe like broken an old window as they were dumping it out. So the guest gets there. They have a dog, and they're like, "Hey, there's glass all in the backyard." So this was like our second guest. And they leave us like a 1-star review. And, there's nothing we could do to fight it because of, we messed up, right? So this listing just struggles because, your second review is a 1-star, like you're like tanked. So we took the listing down. We reinvest about another $12,000 into the garage. The garage was just like, we were just using it for the laundry room. Like that's all we had, but it was a 2-car garage. So we shut it down, invest about $12,000, and we convert the garage into this really cool Mario themed game room. And then we relaunch the listing, and almost immediately it takes off. So we've had a few properties where we launch, we don't get the traction that we want initially. We'll just take it down, we'll make it better, and we'll relaunch it, right? Because we know what it takes to be competitive in those markets. And I'd rather be at the top 25% of my market and competing on experience and being at the bottom 25% and competing on price.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good advice. I'd be lying if I didn't say that we had to do that a few times with some of our properties over the years as well. That's a lot of good information on finding markets, maybe outside of your own, where you want to invest in short-term rentals and how to evaluate some of those. Before we pivot over to how you scaled your Airbnb portfolio and looking for nuggets of wisdom from you in that area, can you tell us what some of your top favorite markets are right now that you're exploring?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, we're really focused right now on kind of the secondary markets. So again, we just bought in Southern Utah. I'm big on that market because I feel like when I talk about those cues, the design, the amenities, the photos, the pricing, the reviews, we see a big opportunity in that market as well. And then, instead of buying a single family home, we end up buying the 13-unit motel out there instead, right? So I do like those markets where there's some room for competition. We have students in our community who are buying kind of all over the place, and maybe markets you've never would have thought of before, and markets in West Virginia that I'd never even considered before. We have folks going out in parts of Pennsylvania that I'd never thought of would be good markets. So I think what's most important, because I can give everyone a list and say, hey, hit this city, hit this city, hit this city, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right city for you. I think what's most important, and this is what I tell folks, is, and this is, say that you're really focused on cash flow, right? I'll give you like a super quick masterclass on how to identify cities, right? Say you're focused on cash flow. Go search 10 cheapest states by median home price. And you're going to get a list of whatever those 10 cheapest states are. I want to say like Arkansas is in there. I think West Virginia's in there as well. There's some other states.
Probably is.
Kentucky might be somewhere in there as well, right? And then once you have that list of states, I want you to search things to do in XYZ state. Mm-hmm. And now you're gonna start identifying, okay, well, what are people doing in X, Y, and Z city, right? Or XYZ state? What are the hot spots within that market? Search for sports teams in XYZ state. Search for, amusement parks. Just identify what are the things that people travel to spend money at in those markets. Okay. And then once you identify that, I want you to go into Airbnb and I just want you to type in the state. Don't even type in a city, just type in the entire state and see what cities and what properties Airbnb is naturally pushing to you. And now you're starting to get a sense of what markets Airbnb favors.
So that's definitely a good recommendation for somebody who's going to have maybe a lower budget.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And usually what you'll see, Jonathan, is that when you start identifying those cities, design's going to be bad, amenities are going to be lacking, basic photos, basic pricing, and still good reviews so you can go in and crush it. And like I said, we've had students identify cities that I never would have thought of investing into because they followed this approach.
That's amazing. And that's the benefit of Airbnb is, you don't have to be in major cities or spend a fortune on the property. If you can identify nuggets like this and little diamonds in the rough where people are traveling, you might not have ever heard about it. That means a lot of people might not have ever heard about it, but they might start to hear about it soon. Very much like the Bourbon Trail in Kentucky that has become, so famous really since COVID, I think. Before then it was a little bit, but blown up since then. And so people are looking all over the state outside of Kentucky for this bourbonism, where bourbon is really driving tourism throughout the state, and they are crushing it. So all good advice. Do you have any tips for navigating the legal landscape in all of these different cities to see if they have ordinances in place, HOAs that don't allow short-term rentals, things like that?
Yeah, so two really important concepts for me when it comes to the regulatory landscape. First is I prefer to invest in markets that are economically dependent on the revenue generated by short-term rentals. Because if there's an economic dependency or reliance on that revenue, you can have at least a high level of confidence that they're going to protect short-term rentals, because what happens if the short-term rentals go away, right? Like we think about New York City, and they pretty much flat out banned short-term rentals in that market, right? But think about what New York City is. What is all of the things that are happening inside of New York City? You have business headquarters, major financial capital of the world. You have sports teams, you have Broadway, you have fashion, you have literally anything that could be driving an economy exists inside of New York City. So how financially important are Tony and Jonathan's little short-term rentals in New York City in comparison to all of the other things that are driving that economy. And it's not very big, right?
Not at all, especially when they have a housing crisis.
On the flip side to that, Jonathan, there's a city outside of Joshua Tree where we have a good chunk of our property. It's called 29 Palms, California. So it's also outside the national park, but just one city over. And I was on a call with someone from the city not too long ago, and they were sharing some data on revenue. And they said that the number one highest revenue source for the city was property taxes. The second highest was the transient occupancy tax being paid by short-term rental guests. And the third was the sales tax of people spending money in local businesses. So you have to imagine, of their top three revenue sources, all of those are impacted by short-term rentals because short-term rental owners are paying property taxes. Short-term rental owners are definitely driving all of the transient occupancy tax. And you have to imagine a lot of the guests who are staying at these properties are going into the local restaurants and gas stations and wherever to spend money. And now they're generating sales tax as well. So that is a city that is economically dependent on the revenue generated by short-term rentals. And those are the kind of cues that we like to see.
Oh, I was going to say, and we all know that, short-term rentals often have a direct tie to property values as well. So, that helps increase some of the property tax too. They change hands a little more frequently as well. So, PVA, they go in and assess properties sometimes every 10 years by computers. If people have owned their house that long, it's not going to increase as much as these properties that are turning over every 2, 3, 5 years. And the new sale price is where the property tax is coming in.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that, but that is such a valid statement, right? Like even just the velocity of transactions is helping them, right? Now, if you go into a city that maybe doesn't satisfy that requirement specifically, right? Where maybe there's a city where there's a good percentage of people who just live there full time, right? The majority of the people who just live there full time and they're commuting somewhere else. Exactly, right? I am okay investing in those markets, but I would want to make sure that the property works as either a midterm or a long term, at least at break even. Right. Because at least now I know my worst case scenario, I can just go, 30 days or more and it can still generate cash flow. But what I wouldn't do is buy a property in a suburban or metro location that positively only works as a short-term rental. Because if regulations change, now what are you going to do? Like, what is the exit strategy?
Absolutely.
So for me, there's some risk mitigation that I like to pull into that strategy as well.
Mm-hmm. All good advice. Now, moving on to scaling, this is something, I think there are a lot of people out there who listen to this podcast might have 1, 2, maybe even 3 short-term rental investments, looking for creative ways to scale. Even people who have a lot of available capital, cash flow on the side, as they start making these purchases and they're putting 20, 25% down with DSCR loans, things of that nature, you're obviously going to become bottlenecked and hamstrung at some point. So how did you start and scale your business in such a short period of time?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'll say, and I'll get into my backstory, but you're right, Jonathan, in that you really only have 3 options to build your real estate portfolio. You either have to have an unlimited amount of capital, which a lot of people can't check that box. You've got to get really good at recycling the existing capital that you have, or you have to be able to leverage other people's capital. Those are really your only 3 options, right?
So again, capital.
They all require capital, right? Now, or I guess you could go creative, right? I know subject to and creative finance are really big options right now as well. So I guess we could add that as like a fourth option. Owner financing, and we actually seller financed our Utah property, believe it or not. So, but it is an option as well, right? But those are really the 4 buckets. Now, what we did a mix of both. So when we first started investing, again, I had a W-2 salary, it was a healthy salary, and we were able to purchase our first 3 short-term rentals just from like working and saving money, right?
Mm-hmm.
Christmas Eve 2020.
What were those price points roughly? Your first
we bought our first one for $600K. We bought our second one for I think $300K, and our third one for about $300K as well.
Okay, so that's about $1.2 million across the first 3, and then you probably did about 20% down on that.
Each of those were between 10 and 15%, if I recall correctly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So because you can sometimes do like vacation home second property loans that might be as low as 15%.
Yeah. Yeah. As low as 10%, actually. Like the first cabin that we bought, it was 10% down. But yeah, so we had those three. And again, Christmas Eve 2020, I get a call from my HR director saying that I'm unemployed. And, got a mortgage, got a family, got bills to pay. And luckily we had saved up a decent chunk of cash. So we had a little bit of runway. And my wife and I kind of looked at each other and we said, well, hey, what if we just take the next 12 months to go really deep into growing this business? And let's just see what happens. And like I said, I lost my job. We had 2 active short-term rentals, one that we were in the process of setting up. 12 months later, we finished with 15. And the way that we scaled was with that second option of leveraging other people's capital. Okay. So
did you say that you went from 3 properties to 15 properties in 12 months?
We did. It was a crazy 12 months, man. It was a wild 12 months. When did you sleep? Yeah, almost never, man. It was
some real estate agents don't even do that many transactions in a year.
Dude, it was, your back's against the wall. You got to figure things out. Right. And
that's true. Some people give up and some people get to work.
Yeah, right. Exactly, man. Exactly. And, we have, so our focus was leveraging other people's capital. We'd already proven out the ability to identify, set up and manage properties. But because I didn't have a job anymore, I couldn't get a loan. The capital that I had saved up for real estate had to go towards keeping the lights on. So I was basically cash poor, right? So we had to figure something out. Emergency fund, right? So we started leveraging partnerships, strategic partnerships to work with other folks who had the capital. They had the desire. They just didn't have the time or the ability to do it themselves. So we would generally partner with other folks who would bring all the capital, and then we would do everything else. And then we just split the profits pretty much down the middle.
Now, what were these friends of friends? Were you in networking groups, or did you literally put together your pitch deck and go out and start raising seed money like a startup?
So I've always believed that in order to grow a business of any size, at some point you're going to need capital from other people. So for me, my focus was on trying to build my brand. And I didn't do it with the expectation of me losing my job and having to kind of call it in so soon. But, I had started my own podcast back in early, maybe even late 2019. And dude, I was chugging along. We were getting a few thousand downloads an episode, and then I became a co-host for the Bigger Pockets podcast. And at that point, now I think we were a top 30 podcast for a long time on the business charts. And I think the exposure that we got from that helped a ton. And then we launched our YouTube channel, which brought in more and got more eyeballs. So we just started to reach out to folks who knew us from these different brands that we had built. And that really gave us an opportunity to start presenting these opportunities to folks. And we were able to kind of pick and choose the partners that we felt matched for each one of those deals.
Okay. So you were leveraging your brand through essentially media to attract potential partners for you. Yeah,
100%.
Okay. So people who are listening that don't have exposure like that or opportunities like that, what would you recommend or what are you recommending to your students to help them do the same?
Start, I would say
Make the first move.
Yeah. And you have to pick the strategy that makes the most sense for you, right? Because maybe podcasting and YouTube isn't everyone's cup of tea, right? Maybe it's not their skill set, and that's fine. But then maybe host a local meetup. You be the guy or the girl that's greeting everyone at the door, getting up on stage and welcoming everyone in, right? Or at least start going to other people's meetups and just shaking hands and being present there. At a minimum, but if you don't have a network of people in your circle currently who have the capital to deploy into your real estate deals, that isn't a reason to stop. You just have to go expand your network. And believe it or not, and this is a big limiting mindset thing that I had to get over, there are a lot of people out there who have money just sitting in a bank rotting right now. And they want to put that money to work, but they just don't have the time to try and figure out where to put it. And if you can come to them with an opportunity that allows them to grow that capital without a large investment of their time, effort, and energy, being backed by an asset that's as strong as real estate, that is a win-win situation. So I would say get out there, find your platform, and start building that network. Jonathan, I was working a full-time job. And when I first launched my podcast, I was putting out 3 episodes a week. This is before Bigger Pockets. So I didn't have the production team. It was Tony Robinson.
Just you, team of one.
Scheduling all the interviews, doing all the editing, posting everything. I did that 3 episodes a week for almost a year. before I got pulled over to the Bigger Pockets podcast. And that's how we built that platform.
Well, you were a man on a mission. Do you do business with friends?
We do. Yeah, we do. I do think I'll frame it this way. We treat our partnerships with folks that we know in the exact same way that we treat partnerships with strangers. Right. Okay. I'll tell you, my mom, she had come into some money and she became a private money lender on one of our flips. And my mom signed the same promissory note that all the other private money lenders signed. She had the same deed of trust. She was on title just like everyone else. She got, she had to wire her funds into escrow like everyone else. She got a refund check from escrow. So we make sure that the paperwork, that the partnership, that everything is outlined so that there's absolute clarity on what this partnership looks like, whether it's a friend, cousin, whoever it may be.
Okay. Have any of those ever gone south? Because
I wouldn't say south. I wouldn't say south, but I mean, we've had partnerships end, but not necessarily because things weren't, because it was bad blood, but just I think priorities change within partnerships and maybe what each of us were looking for when we first started. Maybe our needs are different today, and that's fine, right? People grow, they adapt, what needs change, right? So I think every partnership should be reevaluated on a regular cadence to say, does this still make sense? And if it does, okay, cool, we keep it going. But if it doesn't, then okay, what needs to change? Some sage advice that I got, and this is actually like dating advice. This is, I was like a teenager, but it's just always stuck with me. But someone said it's like when you're in a relationship, the question you want to ask is, knowing what I now know, would I start this relationship over again? And if the answer is no, then you need to end the relationship, right? Because now you're only staying in the relationship because you're already in it. And that is not a reason to keep a relationship going. You got to stay in the relationship because you want to stay in the relationship, right? So that question I always ask. So I'm always evaluating folks that I'm working with, working relationships, partnerships with that same frame of reference, like knowing what I now know, would I still do this? And that's how I make decisions.
And real estate partnerships can be difficult to get out of because, if one of you wants to leave, then that means the other one either has to come up with the capital to buy that one out, or you have to sell the property and liquidate. So you have to make these decisions wisely. I listened to a podcast that you were on recently, or maybe it was an article that I read, and you were talking about avoiding toxic business relationships because they can severely limit your growth. Do you have some experiences with toxic business relationships that were limiting your growth?
I wouldn't say toxic business relationships. I mean, I think my wife and I both try and make sure that we guard kind of who we let into our circle to begin with, because, we just want to make sure that we're working with folks who actually align and believe the same things that we believe in. So we put a big focus on that. But I will say, we have, again, altered and changed and ended relationships based on the needs of each partner. And we try and do it in the nicest and, I guess I'll put it this way. At the end of the day, Jonathan, what's most important to me is my reputation, right? Because I know that my reputation is what allows us to continue to scale our business. And I really want folks who, if you hear Tony J. Robinson, even if we ended the partnership, I still want people to say good things like, hey, Tony's a stand-up guy, right? So that's always kind of the frame of reference that we step into those conversations with.
Absolutely. I mean, nothing's going to limit your ability to raise capital than having a bad reputation, especially in small circles.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit more about amenities. You talked about how you had a hot tub at one of your properties. Wasn't there yet, unfortunately. Guess had a bad experience, but we'll give you a pass on that one. Another one, you were putting in an in-ground pool, which is not a cheap or inexpensive thing to do. What are some of the top amenity recommendations that you have for people? Maybe amenities for lower end properties that don't have high average daily rates, and then maybe for luxury properties that can command a little bit more.
Yeah. AirDNA has a podcast, and Jamie Lane, the VP of Data and Economics at AirDNA, co-hosts that podcast. And they just had a recent episode. I want to say it was like 77 or 70 something. So if you guys go look at their podcast, it just talked about amenities and the impact that it has. And it was a really interesting listen. But basically that amenities impact properties in different ways depending on the market, because some amenities are just table stakes. Like if you go into the Smoky Mountains and you don't have a hot tub, you're probably just not going to get booked. If you go into the Smoky Mountains, right? Yeah. And a lot of people do, right? But if you go into the Smoky Mountains and you don't have like a game room or like a theater room and you're like a 4 or 5 bedroom, same, you're probably not going to get booked. So every market kind of has its own amenities that are just like table stakes. So I think first, just understand what the table stakes are for your specific market. And then what we like to do, Jonathan, and like the reason that we created that Mario themed game room is because this was in a market that didn't really have themed game rooms at the time. And we're starting to see more folks kind of catch on to what we did there. But we stayed at an Airbnb in Disney. We had like a team outing. And we stayed at a really cool Airbnb in Disney. And that property had a Mario themed game room. And, my wife and I are walking around like, this is so cool. We didn't even have a property to do it with at the time. We're like, we're going to keep this in the back of our mind. So when the opportunity presented itself in a market that was literally on the other side of the country, we just said, let's replicate what worked in this market and do the same thing over here. So I like the idea of saying, what is an amenity that's working really well in one market that maybe hasn't made its way into your market? And how can we implement that in a way that makes sense? Right. So there's a lot of different ways to look at it.
And so if you're doing amenities on a small scale, what are some things that you like? Some people have kind of nostalgic, but they'll have a DVD player and a selection of all of these DVDs. Some people might have, a gaming console or something like that. What are some of these low-hanging fruit amenities that guests would really like that people could add to help marketability?
Gaming consoles, super easy. Baby-friendly amenities, the pack and play, the high chair, the baby utensils. Again, super low-hanging fruit that for folks who are traveling with babies, like we have an 8-month-old. Now we're filtering by that again as we're looking for places, right? I would hope this is like, basic for everyone, but things like, making sure you have a smart lock and the folks can get in and out without having to go talk and grab a key, and making sure you have the smart TVs. We've added like the coffee bars to a lot of our properties as well, where we're kind of going beyond the basic like little coffee mean or whatever it is. One of my partners, he's like a coffee snob. So he's like he gets like these really nice coffee machines. So we have coffee machines inside of there. Gosh, I don't know, man. There's a lot of different things that we played around with, but I feel like the game rooms, the hot tubs, those are the ones that we've gotten a lot of a good return on, I'd say.
Okay. And how do you calculate return on that? Like if I'm going to put in, I have to run the electric, I have to buy the hot tub. Let's say we're looking at $10,000 all in for that. What is that going to do to my average daily rate to calculate the return on investment?
It's hard to know with exact certainty, right? Because there are so many other factors that influence average daily rate. But I'll tell you, right, for the in-ground pool that we added, the way that I kind of looked at the data is I said, it's a 3-bedroom property. And I looked at all the other 3 bedrooms in that market. And I looked at like the top 10%. And I said, what are some things that are common between all of these properties that we can try and put into ours? And the pool was one of those. So it's hard for me to say like, hey, this is the exact return on investment that I'm going to get, because again, there's a lot of factors that go into it. But looking at the data and seeing that it was a consistent theme gave me the confidence to say, at a minimum, I should be able to at least get into the top 10% of 3 bedrooms in this market. And if I can do that, here's possibly what I think my new revenue might be. So that's kind of how we look at it. But I wish there was an easier way to say, hey, if I had this hot tub, I'm going to get a 20% return just on this hot tub. It's hard to know for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of guesswork, but I mean, I think at the end of the day, it always makes sense to add amenities. So definitely, I think people need a checklist, go through their properties, see what they can do to enhance it, and definitely take the next steps towards doing that. Well, before we wrap up today, I do want to, Tony, give you some time to talk about your new short-term rental management company that you are putting together. As we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, it focuses on more luxury properties. And I think that, Tony, you've proven today that you know what you're doing in that space, identifying and running top market luxury short-term rental properties in different markets across the United States. So tell us what about this company, what your goals are, and how people can connect with you if they might want to learn more about that or any other services that you offer to investors.
Yeah, Jonathan, I appreciate the opportunity, brother. And what we saw over the last few years here is that there's been an abundance of folks who have jumped into the short-term rental space. And there's 2 things that typically happen. Either A, they grossly underestimated what it takes to actually be successful in this space, and their properties are underperforming and they're unhappy and they're struggling. The second option, or option B, that we've seen is that they place these properties with one of the big national brands and they feel like a small fish in a big pond, and their properties aren't performing the way that they were hoping that it would. So we recognize that there's a big opportunity within this space to give hosts another option, right? An option that's built by folks who actually did this as a living, right? We had to figure this out to keep the lights on, and really making sure that we're only focusing on a specific type of property so we can really get good at that one type of experience for guests. So Airvato Vacation Rentals, I know it's a funky name, but we wanted something that kind of stood out a little bit, but it's Air and then VATO. So if you guys go to airvato.com, but Airvato is a solution to that challenge that a lot of hosts are facing. And our goal with this company is to help hosts who are in between that rock and that hard place, get them out, let us take over management, and hopefully get that property back to what they were initially projecting it would do.
Very nice. And do you do any consulting, any masterminds, offer any education courses to investors? Because you have a lot of information to share.
We do, man. I'd say the best place to go, Tony J. Robinson on Instagram, pretty much everything else is there. But we have events that we host. We have our coaching program. We have our YouTube channel. We have the podcast. We have newsletter. There's a lot of different ways to get in touch. But I'd say Tony J. Robinson on Instagram is probably the best place to get in touch.
Well, I'm definitely going to plug in with you because as much as I know and as long as I've been doing this, there are always new things to learn out there. I definitely learned quite a few on this call today. So thank you, especially for that mastermind on identifying different areas for investment and how to do a quick analyzation of those. Very, very powerful.
Yeah, Jonathan, I appreciate you taking the time to have me on, brother. And I hope your audience got some value from this. And kudos to you, man, for taking the time to put this podcast together. As a fellow podcaster, I know how much work goes into this. And sometimes it can be a thankless job. So just know I appreciate the work that you're doing as well, brother.
Absolutely. We appreciate you being on. Thank you all for listening. Again, my name is Jonathan Klunk, host of Real Estate Mentor, the #1 real estate mentorship podcast, out today with another great episode. Tune in 2 weeks where we're going to cover another real estate topic with valuable nuggets that you can take away and put into your business the same day. Have a great day.